My name is Don Maison. That's spelled Maison. And I was born in Kansas City, Kansas, 1923. My grandfather was a Frenchman that came over here when he was a lad to keep from being serviced, in the military. His dad sent him over here, and he married a Dutch girl, Holland Dutch, and they moved to Coffeyville, Kansas. So my father worked for Phillips Petroleum and was a stationary engineer. And he had eastern Kansas there. He worked at a little town of about 300 people, Edgerton. And then after I got to be about a freshman in high school, we moved to Lyons, Kansas, and he worked there until he retired. And he got my cousin, who was lived with us for a while, got her a job with Phillips, and she's still with him. She's got more stock, and I suppose you'd call it payola. And she's a personal secretary to some of the brass down in Bartlesville. I went to freshman year at Edgerton, and then at Lyons the next 3 years. I graduated there. We won the state championship in basketball, and I won the Kansas Interscholastic Pole Vault Championship with the old vaulting pole, the bamboo pole. Kansas University. I was listening to the radio, and I didn't know what to do. Didn't know whether to sign up or go enlist somewhere or finish my school year. I finished that semester and didn't enlist until later on. I enlisted at the old customs building down in Denver. I went to Denver University after I left KU. I came out to Denver on a basketball scholarship. And when I went down to enlist, it was in November, and they called me to active duty in February of the following year, of 43. We took all our exams, written exams there in the customs house. And you had to have a certain grade before you could qualify. Later on, in my military, I was at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. And then they switched us over to Washington University in St. Louis for 6 months. It really was nothing more than a place to reserve bodies so that they had a place to run them on through the Air Force, We went, like I say, to the reserve, really, at Washington University for 6 months. And then we went to San Antonio to classification, which is where they gave you a battery of psychiatric tests and things like that, and to decide whether you would be a pilot, a co-pilot, or a navigator. I qualified for the pilot, and at the end of the training, they filled out an application to go on to advance, and they asked you, where did you want to go? And I said, anywhere but B-24 school. And that's where I ended up. I wanted to go to P-38s, which is a fighter pilot. Of course, everybody wanted to be a fighter pilot. And you had to weigh, at that time, you had to weigh at least 155 pounds to, to qualify for a bomber pilot. Because if you lost two engines on one side, it took a lot of leg power to straighten up your aircraft and go ahead on, say, on takeoffs or someplace like that. Well, then you started your pilot's training, and you went to Stamford, Texas for primary. And we went from there to Perrin Field in Sherman, Texas for basic. And that's where we flew the big, felt like you were riding a locomotive compared to what you flew in primary. And after basic, you went to advanced, and I went to Ellington Field in Houston and took twin engine school. Had everything was twin engine there. The old C11, C14, they were actually planes that were there for the benefit of the navigators, because they would seat about 5 guys who would do their navigational work on that airplane. And I was in the last class to graduate as pilots at that time, which was, I graduated from pilot school in 44, August of 44. And from there, it went to navigators. They used Ellington as a training for navigators. I went to B-24 school, Fort Worth, Texas. And after B-24 school, I went to Charlotte. And that's where they brought the crews together. We got our navigators and engineers, all our gunners, all of them. And they came together, and we trained as a crew. I had a navigator that didn't want to go to active duty, so he kept getting lost all the time. We finally had to get another navigator. Well, it was a hard plane to fly. And for a long time, I used to be a standard joke about, let's go watch the B-24s take off and crash. And basically, the hydraulic system and the flaps operated off of a little electric motor down back in there. And if you had gas leak and fumes and a spark came from that electric motor, you'd blow up on takeoff, because that was when you used the flaps. So later on, they developed it into hydraulic, and you eliminated that problem. But that was one of the biggest problems they had with the 24s at that time. Stayed with the same group, went on to Mitchell Field in New York, picked up a brand new B-24, and flew out of there on secret orders. We couldn't read where we were supposed to go until we got so many miles north of New York. And then we broke out the orders and said, go to Bangor, Maine. And we went to Bangor, Maine, and that was where we took no more training, but just waited for the weather. Everything from that time on was dependent upon the weather, whether the winds were good or bad or indifferent, and to fly to Bermuda. And that was the first leg of our flight over to China. Most of those flights along there, we flew to Bermuda, and we were there 5 days waiting for the winds to get okay between the Azores and Bermuda. And when they finally did, well, then we went on to the Azores, and then we went to Dakar in Africa. which was, again, a short hop across the Atlantic. And from there on, we flew the North North Africa, and we flew across all, just right after they had all the tank warfare and so on, and there were tanks all over the desert. We could fly down low so we could see them. And we flew from there to, every flight was, about 5 hours. 5 hours to, say, Tobruk and to Benghazi, and finally ended up in Cairo. And at Cairo, they had the worst rainstorm they had had in 300 years. And we had been in town, and we went back out to the base where the plane was, and our B-4 bags were floating around in water about that deep in our rooms. And we were there for 5 days while they went through the hydraulic system and the brake system to make sure there was no water in there. And while they did that, we went sightseeing in Cairo, out to the pyramids and down to the river there, where King Farouk had a boat furnished by the United States Air Force. And we went to the museum where King Tut, in solid gold, I guess you didn't call it a casket, but that's what it was. From there on, we went across the Suez Canal and went to Iraq and Baghdad and places there like that, and then flew on in to Karachi, India. And from there, we went down to the southern part of India to a place called Bangalore, which was a service area for all the planes. As soon as the plane hit the ground, we had people all over it taking the clocks out and stripping it. They stripped it of everything, and then put the machine guns and so on. Then they separated us from our plane. We had flown that plane all the way from Mitchell Field over there. And we went to a place, a distribution point in India. And from there we went to a place called Roopsy, India, which was nothing more than a base that was cut out of the jungle. And we ended up being stationed there. He lived in a barracks, or a basha, what they called it, which was a straw hut. And there was about 6 to a basha with beds made out of rope. And the straw on the top, they had like gunny sack to keep the mice and the rats from running around. You could see them running around, and the guys would lay in there in bed and shoot them, with birdshot. They had birdshot in their 45s. But that was occasionally you'd have a tiger come in and look around, tear your bedding apart. You were in the jungle where the Indians would come around and cut the grass, keep the grass down so the animals would stay away from there. Basha, and they always kept their women back away from the Bashas. The women would be cutting grass too, but they'd never get up close to the Bashas. Say once in a while there would be a hunt for a tiger that was on the loose, and everybody wanted to go on that, of course, because the local Maharaja who owned and controlled that particular part of the land would be out looking for these tigers. They'd be on their elephants and riding with their drum beaters and all that, going out ahead, trying to scare them out. We were a part of the 14th Air Force. We had been assigned to the 14th Air Force, 308th Bomb Group, and the 313th Squadron. And one of the reasons that we had been assigned there was because I had a good navigator. 7 out of 10 that were lost were due to the weather. They lost more planes due to bad weather and being lost than they did to the Japanese in flying the Hump, which is what we ended up doing. Claire Chennault was our commanding general. He had to make to do with all of the brass who didn't like him because he was a little bit overbearing. But he knew what he was doing, and he did a good job for the time that he was there and what he had to work with. He was an outstanding general, I would say. When we got there, he had already been absorbed into the Air Force and was a part of the Air Force, which he didn't like because he didn't have the control that he used to have. When he was the AVG, he was it. He could get anything done that he wanted done with Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese thought the world of him. So anytime he wanted anything, he just asked for it, and they gave it to him. Yeah, I saw him.
Oh, you did?
I didn't pay any attention to him when I first went over there. He was a softball player, and he used to have a team over in his bailiwick, and he would challenge all the other squadrons and put up $25,000 that he could beat them. And in most cases he could. They would convert him, would put 3 great big gasoline rubber tanks in the middle, in the bomb bay. And we were flying gasoline over to the fighter boys, P-40s primarily. They later on got into the 51s and the P-38s, but not. They call it a forgotten war, and it was kind of because they didn't get very much equipment over there. When we used to fly into Kunming, and your engineer would take a measuring stick and measure all of your gas tanks to see how much gas you had left and how much you would need. The word was need to fly home. And if you could fly home with a minimum amount of gas, they would take more gas out of your tanks, and for the B-25s and the fighter boys. And you never knew because the weather reports weren't that good. So you never knew what your winds are going to be there. You could start flying to one place, go on a heading, and end up 100 miles off course due to side winds and crosswinds and bad weather. Once in a while, you'd run out of gas going home, and so you'd land at another field somewhere. Kunming was the headquarters for General Chennault, and we'd fly into Kunming, and at the first flight that we went in there, the runway was a dirt runway, and you had these Indians and Chinese with the poles over their shoulders, little baskets, carrying little pieces of dirt that they put around and stomp in, and that was what they were using to make the runway smooth. And you had some Chinese that would dance in front of you as you landed. They were hoping that the propeller would cut off the devils that were attached to their head or whatever it might be. And of course, they had an occasional accident. The Chinese were primarily laborers that we had to come in contact with. And of course, they loaded or unloaded whatever you carried. That was their job, was the same as it was during the Vietnam War. In most cases, you made a quick turnaround. You eat eggs. You'd eat eggs before you went, eggs after you got there, and eggs when you got home, powdered. And it was just a quick turnaround because they wanted you out so they could get other planes in. After you had your mission, you'd have a day or two off, and then you'd fly again. So the only thing we ended up doing in most cases was playing softball. You carried everything from mules to gasoline. I was going to say toilet paper, but that was a luxury that nobody had. 26 got you the one award, and if you got 50, you got another award. As it turned out, I got 26 going to China, and then later, in later years, when I was flying with the Guard and flying to Vietnam, I got another 26 and I got the other award. Most of our problem was weather. The monsoon season was from along in November and October and along in through there. And so you had a lot of rain, a lot of clouds, and I had a takeoff once. That was a thrill. My co-pilot forgot to change the flap handle, and we were just going over the tops of the trees, and we couldn't get up because we had the full flap down. My engineer finally yelled, "Flaps!" And I looked down there, and there was just a little lever showing the flaps all the way down. So I told him to milk them up, which meant just bring them up a little bit at a time. And he did. And about that time, our number 3 engine caught fire because we had pushed the throttles all the way to the stops, and it had overloaded. And so I told him to go ahead and put the fire out. He tried to, but he couldn't do it. But about that time, it was raining so bad, that it helped control the fire. And we gone on up and got flying around to burn some gas off because we figured we had to go back and land. So we flew around for a couple hours and finally went in to land. And when I landed on the first third of the runway and I put the brakes on, they locked. And I went down the runway clear to the end. off the end of the runway, across a little ditch that was there, which wiped out my landing gear, and then slid on through the mud across the road on to the other side. And by the time we had gotten to the end of the runway, I had all the bomb bay doors open, and up every door was open, so that everybody could get out in a hurry. And they did. I got out, I looked down there, and there on the ground was about that much daylight underneath the bomb bay door. So I dove down there and rolled out, looked down across the field, and there was my crew about a quarter of a mile away, just running like mad because they were afraid of a fire. But with all the rain, there was no fire. Nobody hurt. It was quite a takeoff when you were putting your compass on the runway heading, and then you had to hold it steady and then not move one way or another. It gives you a thrill. And he was getting his thrills, and he just got too scared. The only other time that I can think of was we were flying over to Kunming, and we froze up. The controls and the propellers got ice on them, and we couldn't control the plane. And we were at an altitude that put us right at the top of some of those 20,000 foot. So we didn't know whether we wanted to go down or up. You couldn't see. And there was they had no radio approaches that would work for you. So I was running the controls through, and they couldn't move. They were frozen solid. And about that time, the prop started de-icing and started throwing the ice off, and it was rattling off of your headset, and it came loose. But we were ready to bail out because we didn't want to ride it down. We had no way of knowing where we were going to land. You had heaters that worked sometimes, and if it didn't work, you froze. We had better clothing when we were in basic training than we did when we were flying over the hump. We had our flying uniforms, and that was about the size of it. No, you just stayed away from them. Usually somebody would say there's, some 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock, whatever. And if you could, which in most cases you could because of the weather, you went into the clouds. The guys flying C-47s flew between the mountains, down the valleys. If the weather was bad and they missed the valley, they were prime target for bad weather crash. And at that point in China and India, if you bailed out, if you were lucky, you would come close to a village of some kind that would help you. There were some headhunters in the mountains, but they didn't do anything except ask for bucksheesh, and if you give them some money or something like that, they'd carry you out. we went up to about 13,000 feet. There's a lot of mountains that are 20,000 feet high. It just made it that much harder. They had some C-54s over there that would fly, and a lot of C-47s and C-46s, which was I think Air Transport Command, and they had a lot of those flying in that area. We came back, and we flew back with about 10 or 12 enlisted personnel that had been over there for anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Some of them never had been home, and they got priority, and so they flew with us in our plane, and we came back the same way that we went over, along the African coast and Cairo and down to South America, Natal, and then up to Puerto Rico, and then into Florida, into West Palm Beach. I went down that line where if you go to the right, you stay in. If you go to the left, well, you get out. And I was thinking of staying in. And I got up there and I said, no. And I got out. That was quite a thing, really. That was something that they really did that was good, and that was furnish that money for all those guys to go to school. And I was a lot of them that took advantage of it. I came back to the University of Denver and started school again. I was a walk-on candidate for football and made the team and played defensive halfback. And the following year, on about the second day of practice, a guy clipped me and broke cartilage in my knee. And from that time on, I had nothing but trouble with that knee, and never did get it really working again. So that was the end of my football playing days. I kept going out, and I was on the team, but I just really didn't accomplish anything. I originally went out, when I started at KU, I was going to become a coach, to phys ed, but after looking through the microscope at some of those little bugs in zoology and not being able to draw a picture of them, I gave it up and went to business. 49, I went back and took education sequence so that I could be a teacher if I needed to be and fall back on. And I was within 2 weeks of getting my degree for teaching when I was offered a job with a national gypsum company. And I went to work for them and worked for them for 14 years. And they sent me to Dodge City as a salesman for almost a year and a half. And then I came back to Denver and was appointed a district sales manager. And I was district sales manager for 5 years. Well, we were the 55th family that moved in here. I had a brother-in-law at that time that lived out here, had moved in about a month or two ahead of us. And other than that, we didn't know anybody out here. I thought it was a good place to send the kids to school. Casey Enser, who was one of the builders here, was a good friend who I knew through my work. And when I was on the school board and we needed schools, I went to him and asked him about what we could do. I said, we've got to have some schools. He says, how many do you need? And I said, well, at least 5. He says, okay, I'll start on them tomorrow. and he built 5 right along, what is it, First Avenue, by the church up there, right east of the church. And those were the buildings that he built for the schools. I was a committee man on the Scouts, and was with the Junior Chamber of Commerce. It was one of those kind of groups I belonged. They were always sparking something. The baseball program that they had was proven to be excellent. The kids grew up, went on to high school, turned into good ball players. We went to the store down at the bottom of the bank that Jim Van Buskirk ran. He came in here from Nebraska, and he opened a store in the bottom of the Savings and Loan building. And there's quite a few people out here, I think, that used to trade there. There wasn't much here except they kept saying there's going to be 60,000 people here one of these days. And eventually there, I guess we'll make it. I have mixed emotions sometimes. I hate to see it go too fast, but I'm glad to see that it's growing steadily. And one of the things that surprised me, well, just the real estate has grown from 16,000, $12,000 houses to $120,000 houses. That's amazing to me. There were so many other people that had moved over here, including Siebers and Jerry Russell and Van Buskirk, and just a lot of people that we knew had moved here. And we thought, well, that must not be all bad. So we moved over. They had their potlucks and things like that, and they all had them together. My experience with Boulder has been bad all the way ever since we've been here. Even when I was on the school board, we had kids that went to school up there that the school board at Boulder wouldn't let them graduate. They wouldn't let them buy their book. And, you know, tax-wise, the money they spent up at Boulder, not for the Denver school, the Broomfield schools. We needed a lot of help, and they never did give it to us. So my feeling, I even had a guy that bought a house here and was getting ready to move in, and was getting ready to close his loan from a bank in Boulder that he worked at. And they wouldn't give him his loan because he was buying a house in Broomfield. Yeah, I think that we ought to handle all our own. And then started flying with the Wyoming Guard. You had to have at least 1,000 hours to qualify with them, and they were flying at that time C-121s. Remember the triple tail that Eisenhower used as a plane? That's what we were flying. You had a loadmaster, and you never knew what you were going to. We'd fly from Cheyenne. We'd fly into Travis Air Force Base just outside of San Francisco, and you never knew what you were going to be picking up. And when you'd land there, that would be his job from that time on to get your plane loaded and ready to go the next morning. And if they needed, they could take all the seats out and put stretchers, or carry priority. A lot of times you carried priority stuff like maybe a drive shaft for a air carrier, something like that. I had 1,000 hours when I went up there. And when I retired, I had over 3,000 hours. They were flying missions into Japan and the Philippines and Korea and in most cases they were going into Vietnam, and we'd take Coors beer over to the Colorado National Guard who were stationed over there at that time, and they were always looking for us when we'd come in there. But you'd land at say Tonsanut or Da Nang or one of those places, and they'd rush you in and line you up in a line, and then they would have the locals come unload you and get you on out as quick as possible, because in most cases you were subject to mortar fire, which the local natives were pretty good at. Yeah, we had became pretty close. You'd get out the end of the runway, you're getting ready to take off, and you'd have a shell land here, and right at a cage. There was an island right off the coast that when you take off, you'd fly. If you flew the heading that you took off, you'd fly right over it. And they always had somebody up there that would be shooting at you. So you'd either turn right or turn left as soon as you got off, so that you missed that island. And a lot of times you were taking Navy people back to Japan. Well, we had a interesting flight into Da Nang one time. We had been probably 100 miles out when we hit a storm, and we flew through the storm all the way into Da Nang, and then radar picked us up and brought us in for a landing. But they were circling us around to line us up with the runway, and the engineer says, "I can see trees," and which was a thing you never like to hear, but he was right. They had us down pretty low, but we brought us on around and brought us in to runway left. So they said, well, they'd turn the lights on. So they turned the lights on runway right, and we were on the final approach. And so we're going down, and we have to vary over to the right to see the runway that had the lights on. And about that time, they discovered that they were wrong, so they turned them off and turned the lights on the left. So here we are up there going back and forth on the final approach. So we finally come over on the runway left and where the lights are. And by that time, we're about halfway down the runway. And he said, "Are you going to land it up here?" And I said, "No, I just am running out of runway." So I chopped all the power off and went on down and landed. We rolled to the end of the runway, and we were right on the end. We hardly had room to turn around. And say that was one of the times that it'd give you a real thrill trying to go back and forth and be able to get down fast enough, and particularly when it's raining. It's hard to see out of your windows. I don't care how good your wipers are or whatever. They don't work good enough to be able to really see very good and judge your distance. One that lives over in Thornton, and one in Salem, Oregon, and another one over in Westminster. Donnie, the oldest one, has the highest secret rating that you can have for his job. They used to work in that out there at Buckley where those white shells are. They used to work out there. Now they're still in the area, but they're not in the shells anymore. And he can't tell you what he does. It's unbelievable. It's just completely unbelievable that it could happen and did happen. I think it's been as strong, or if not stronger, that everybody wants to help. And after Pearl Harbor, everybody didn't know exactly what to do. It took a while to get things up, but this was immediate. The reaction of people was just immediate, and it was one of those things that is a little closer to home because of the firemen and the policemen that were involved. I think he'll be dead when if they find him. Some of his own people will turn him in for the money. So if they don't turn him in, he'll be dead. I don't know whether we'll ever be able to dig him out, because they're as bad dug in as good as the Vietnam and the Vietnamese had tunnels under there that they could march armies through. And I think this is going to be the same way.